Hi, I'm Dan McDermott. Thanks for watching. This is yet another tech show. I'm going to talk about newspapers. This is a bit of a stretch. This really is, I guess, it's fairly old technology, newspapers. But I was reading on a blog today that the basic premise on TechCrunch. It's a good article, but the basic premise was, are newspapers dead everywhere or just in the United States? And you hear this a lot from folks that are involved in new media, that have never worked at a newspaper before, perhaps. I don't know if this author had. But I own 2 newspapers, and I can tell you we're not dead. The big city papers that published yesterday's wire service stuff that everyone who cares about read on Drudge Report or Huffington Post yesterday, and don't do any hyper-local stuff because they're big, and everyone's making $100 grand a year or more. The publisher's making millions. Those guys are down a precarious road. And I commented along these lines in the Post. Often they're owned by corporations, big papers. They used to make 20% a year profit. That's unheard of. Walmart's making 5% on a good year probably. But the 20% profit's amazing. So, I think that you have to look at papers that are doing well. Our papers are doing well. The key is, I look back to the analogy when radio faced television. And the programs that were first on television were basically radio programs with the same people. I think 60 Minutes started out on the radio. And then, or its precursor did. But what happens is when a new thing comes along, the big guys have to adapt or die. And in this case, some are not doing well. Some have gone out of business. A bunch have gone out of business. But it's a delivery mechanism. What's different about going from radio to television is it's still a visual medium. But with the internet, you can still, it's interactive. You can read things. You can watch video. You can listen to audio. So it's sort of like the super media delivery mechanism. Whereas in the past, it wasn't like that. You couldn't, there wasn't anything where you could interact. You could listen. You could see visuals. You could look at picture stills. And so it's a whole new ball game. And it's a bigger jump for folks who are used to printing a newspaper. But the key is, to make it work, you have to give people, the reason they're not buying the newspaper isn't because the internet's better. The reason is they're getting the information ahead of time. So if you're running a paper and you're writing about what Tim Geithner said yesterday, what Barack Obama said yesterday, the latest on the oil spill, that sort of thing, then people got all that on the internet already, or most people are interested. Some, different. But if you can provide a niche that people can't get elsewhere, for example, the Wall Street Journal, they charge for a lot of their content. They give some of it away. And if you can, for example, in our case, we have small local papers. We write about the local town council, the local school board, the local government meetings. CNN doesn't cover those things. We're in a town of 14,000 people. So CNN is not here for every town council meeting and every county board of supervisors meeting. So we have some competition from other newspapers. But basically, there's no national media covering what we cover. So we try to provide local content that is relevant to the people, a small paper, circulation about 9,000, and we can offer affordable advertising rates, that kind of thing. So those papers are still doing well. And then when we break it out on the internet, a lot of papers, they come up with a completely different product online. Well, the problem there is there's no money online. If you're a typical site, like a blog, you're making $100 every year. A Drudge Report is an exception. We have 1 or 2 guys, and they're, he's doing this site, and it has millions of hits. Then you can make big money, 6, 7 figures. But then you have other sites like Huffington Post, which I think has traditionally hemorrhaged cash because it's a big outfit, and they get a lot of hits. But you can't generate enough money in print or online as you can in print because the ads just don't work. When I'm looking at a local newspaper, the local ads are content just like the paper. And there's a half-page ad here on page 6. There's a quarter-page ad on this page. And I'm looking at them as I go. When I'm online, I almost never look at the ads. I don't know why. It just doesn't work for me. And you can't charge as much because they're not as effective. But so what we do is, with our newspapers, we actually take the PDF of the whole paper and put it online. So if if Joe's Hardware Store is on page 6 in the print edition, he's also on page 6 on the PDF online. And so we're not screwing our print advertisers by breaking the product out to a non-profitable platform just because everyone else is doing it. And that's my theory. You know, if we're still here in a few years, I'm right. Otherwise, you know, who knows? But you do have to address internet. And so what we're doing is things like this, where we're coming up with different content to put on the internet, but we're not going to sacrifice our print product, because it's not necessarily that it's printed, it's that it's laid out as a book or a magazine or a newspaper, where you have a cover, you have page 2 and 3 and 4, and it's linear. It's not random access. I mean, you can turn to page 6, but most people look through a newspaper. They might go to the classifieds or the Sudoku or the crossword or the sports section, but basically you thumb through it and you kind of glance at every page. Whereas if I'm looking for an article on CNN or Drudge or Huffington, I'm just going to look at the headline that interests me, click on it, and go to that story. I'm not going to then, if it's on the Guardian newspaper, I'm not going to read every story in the Guardian. But if I'm going to it through a website aggregator. But if I'm looking at a print product, if I have the Guardian in my hand, I probably would go through the whole thing. It's just a different experience. It's linear as opposed to random access. It's going through. I used to describe this like the post office. I used to teach computer programming to kids. I said it's like a record player. You know, you start, you have to, or a cassette tape. You have to fast forward through to get to the middle song. Whereas with the CD, you can just press 5 and go to song 5. Or you can go to a postal box. You don't have to go through all the boxes to get to yours. You can go right to your box. That's the whole point of aggregating to a story on the internet, or that's analogous to that, versus a newspaper, which I'm going to say linear because I can't think of a better way to phrase it. So how we're going to address all these things, I have no idea. We're trying to do it. We're doing it the way we're doing it, but I can tell you that the reason the newspaper's dying is because, in my opinion, they're too big. Everyone was making too much money. They got fat and lazy. They weren't doing enough original local coverage, the kind of hard-hitting stuff that, like 60 Minutes, which has lasted so long, does so well. They were, you know, they're a victim of their own success. And they were like a famous line in John Grisham book: "Newspapers don't print newspapers; they print money." Well, that, of course, you know, back in the 80s, maybe 70s and 80s, but today that's not the case. But the key, I think, is a small paper. If I owned the Post, the Washington Post, I'd break it up into 20 different papers, and I would have you know, local bureaus back. They're shutting down their local bureaus. They're actually doing the apps, and they're getting rid of these Pulitzer Prize quality writers, and it's just a shame because they were so good for so long, and I wish them well. I have friends at the Post, but it's just sad to see this state of affairs. But you got to take a step back and look at why people aren't buying a newspaper. If you're providing content they read yesterday on the internet, they're not going to buy your content. If you give it away free, if you make it local, super local, and give them stuff they can't get anywhere else, they'll pick the paper up. So print is not dead. The big guys just need to learn a few lessons and be able to jump out of that mouse wheel and look at the perspective of why people aren't buying their papers as much as they used to. So that's my 2 cents coming. And I'm, like I said in the TechCrunch comment I made, I said, you know, I'm biased. I own 2 papers, but the notion of someone who's probably never worked at a newspaper declare, and you see this on Huffington Post all the time. You know, they're always, you know, newspapers are dead, and, you know, Death Watch, all this stuff. But they're not dead. They just need to adapt, and they need to look at a smaller business model and have a group of small papers as opposed to one big monolith where you can't really devote the local coverage because it's too big. You're covering too many different places. That's my 2 cents. Hope you enjoyed it. This is yet another tech show. Again, it was a stretch because it's not really technical, but I guess you could say newspapers are technology, albeit an old one. But I do thank you for watching. You can catch all the shows at McDermottReport.com, and have a great day.